Good evening, everyone, and thanks for that. Thanks for your patience during that slight delay. You know why we had it, and we're all set to go. I have the job tonight and the pleasure tonight of introducing someone who needs no introduction, really. Professor David Shambaugh, as many of you know, is one of America's and the world's leading China watchers. He is recognized for his, I would say, candor, paid close attention to for his writings and analysis in both the corridors of power and elsewhere in Washington, D.C. and in Beijing. Sometimes officials in both of those capitals may not like what they read or hear from his analysis, but they certainly pay very close attention to everything that he publishes, and he has published a great deal. Most recently, what we'll be hearing about tonight is China's Future, which I think is a book that has a title that may have a question mark at the end of it. It certainly is prominent there on the cover, and we're in for a real treat. Because this book, copies of which are available over here before, well, I should say during and after, but let's wait till after. And I'm sure he'd be happy to sign a copy after you purchase it tonight. This is really, I think, kind of our chance to hear his take on the many developments that have been going on in Beijing, in China, in the last year or so. The book is 2016 with Polity Press and contains much up-to-date information, obviously. I will also just do the normal background information. He is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs and Director of the China Policy Program at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. A position that he moved to prior to that, anyway. He was a reader in Chinese politics at the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies and was editor of the China Quarterly. He will be a visiting professor next year at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. And as many of you know, and as many of you who've read his contributions, he is a scholar who is a publicly engaged intellectual, frequent contributor to various international media, both electronic and print, and of course websites, been a consultant to various governments, research institutions, foundations, and is finally, I'll say, a prolific author, the author of over 300 articles and 30 books. I suppose this is number 30. Maybe it's number 31, depending on the date of my bio here. But please join me in welcoming Professor David Shambaugh.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. I appreciate it very much, and thank you, Mark, for your very kind introduction. Let me just get the computer situated here. It's a real pleasure to be here at the New School, and I want to thank you, Mark, for inviting me, and to the India-China Institute for hosting tonight's book launch lecture. Anyway, thank you really very much for coming, and I want to thank the Institute for hosting this lecture, and Ambassador Rao for being the commentator on my talk tonight. And I'd like to acknowledge, finally, somewhere in the audience, my son Christopher is here. There he is. Who I want to thank for coming to hear his dad talk, but more importantly, he's a student here at the New School, so getting his master's degree. So thanks to all of you for turning out. While I appreciate that you probably came this evening hoping for a nice, simple answer to the question, what is China's future? I'm going to disappoint you. There's a reason for the question mark on the cover. I would not be so naive as to either try and provide one simple answer to China's future. There is no simple answer to China's future. None of us know. This is an incredibly complex subject, but needless to say, one of the key ones in international affairs. And it's also one of the more hazardous subjects, I should say, for sinologists and others who watch China to try and analyze. The landscape, the sinological landscape, one might say, is littered with a number of individuals' predictions that were not realized, or questionable assumptions, unanswered questions, and I dare say a few tarnished reputations. So wandering into this terrain, into this space of trying to even discuss China's future can be professionally hazardous. But I think it's incumbent upon us, whether we're China specialists or India specialists or America specialists or any other kind of specialist, to try and wrestle with the complexities of the country that is the object of our study. After all, if we don't understand those countries and cannot try and discuss at least and elaborate the variables at play in a given country at a given time, who can? So I think it's professionally incumbent upon academics to undertake such an exercise. At the same time, we've got to be quite, I think, humbled as to our predictive capacities. Nobody has a crystal ball. In fact, China watching today is a lot like, brings to mind the ancient Indian fable of the three blind men who feel the elephant, right? And each one thinks they're feeling a different beast. They're feeling a different part of the beast, but they think they're feeling a different beast. Actually, that might make a very good logo for the India-China Institute. It just occurred to me, three blind men and the elephant. But China today is indeed so filled with contradictions and complexities that it defies prediction. In fact, in the 40 years or so that I've been watching and studying China, I've never had a greater sense of uncertainty about the country and fragility in the country. One just has a sense that it's a kind of volcano with a lot of churning under the surface that you can't really see, but you can sort of feel. And if you talk, visit China and you speak with Chinese, one finds at least anecdotal evidence of that. So I think the best we can do as analysts is to carefully study available data, work with multiple sources, both inside of China and outside of China, in Chinese language and other languages, identify the principal variables that are at work in that country and to some extent the trajectories of those variables and indeed the intersection of those variables. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, to view China through a comparative lens. If I'm going to give you one takeaway tonight, it is to view China through a comparative lens. China is, I like to say, maybe distinct, but it is not unique. It is experiencing many of the same challenges and issues that all newly industrializing economies experience at a certain stage of development as they enter the so-called middle income trap. And the Chinese political system is a Leninist type authoritarian political system. Leninist political systems are a subtype of authoritarian systems. So, and they too have as I'll explain this evening, they have their own rather predictive life cycles, if you will, and stages of evolution. So China is not unique. And I think that if we apply comparative metrics and comparative perspectives to studying China today, it will help illuminate some of the potential pathways forward and the potential development of that country. It's also instructive, I think, to bear in mind Chinese history. China's been around for a very long time, has passed through many dynasties, and there are rather predictable patterns in those dynastic cycles, particularly in the declining phase of dynastic cycles that I think are also illuminating. So as China analysts, we've got to work with a number of perspectives kind of simultaneously. But to work with only the sinological perspective, seeing China only qua China, is not going to get us very much value added, I don't think. So with this kind of admonition, I try and, let me briefly describe the book and how I try and apply these different perspectives to China's current contemporary condition and what it might mean for the future. So China, it's no secret that it's at a series of key turning points in the last few years. After more than 3 decades of successful, dramatically successful economic reforms, social reforms, and for a while, even political reforms, it's reached a number of junctures since about 2007 or 8. In its economy, with respect to its society, its political system, its environment, technology, intellectual development, national security, foreign policy, and other areas of development. No matter which sphere you look at, there are diminishing returns have set in. The diminishing returns of the developmental model that Deng Xiaoping launched in 1978 is running its course. It hasn't hit the wall, it hasn't completely run its course, but it has reached diminishing returns. That's no secret. Indeed, it is widely recognized by both China watchers and Chinese leaders. And they all recognize that change is required. Even China's leaders, as I say, are fairly transparent about this, fairly honest in some of their public discourse, more previous to the recent period. But the last premier, Wen Jiabao, is rather famous for having bluntly described in his last year in office in 2011, he bluntly described the nation's economy as being characterized by what he called the 4 uns: unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. That's the premier of the country, the man in charge of the Chinese economy. Unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. That's pretty damning. Then his successor, Li Keqiang, the current premier, also offered a fairly dire assessment last year in 2015, and I quote again, "China's economic growth model remains inefficient. Our capacity for innovation is insufficient. Overcapacity is a pronounced problem, and the foundation of agriculture is weak," unquote. Then we have the current preeminent leader, I guess we should call him Xi Jinping, who late last year in 2015 also lamented, quote, "The tasks that our party faces in reform, development, and stability are more onerous than ever, and the conflicts, dangers, and challenges are more numerous than ever." So even China's leaders, this is not just foreign China watchers, even China's leaders evince the view that the nation faces a number of really pretty severe challenges and is at a series of key turning points. So that's what this book is about, the challenges and the turning points. And there are functional chapters in it on the Chinese economy, China's society, China's polity, and China's role in the world. So time does not suffice to kind of run through each of those functional chapters in any detail. What I'm going to do instead is to just let you digest a little bit what I think some of the major challenges in each of those functional categories are. I'm happy to talk about any of them in more detail when we get to the question and answer period. And one reason for doing this is because I know you're probably most interested in what predictions I have for where China might be headed. So I will give you a few pathways forward. But first, let's just sort of walk through these a little bit, starting with the economic challenges. Again, I don't want to take time to really run through all of these. Many of these are quite familiar to you. Declining growth rates, the need to shift to a more consumer-driven, service sector-driven, and innovation, above all, innovation-driven economy from the old model of low-end exports plus fixed asset investment into infrastructure, right? So the debt problem, by the way, I commend to you this week's issue of The Economist, which has a special feature on China's debt situation, which I was worried even before I read it, but having read it last night, industrial structure reform, labor market, hukou reform, financial sector restructuring or lack of it, and so on, capital outflight, innovation. These are not new subjects. They're written about, but each of them in themselves are huge, and taken together, one has to sympathize, frankly, with Chinese leadership and Chinese economists for trying to tackle them. And to be fair, they came out with a rather sophisticated, comprehensive blueprint on how to tackle them in the third plenum of the 18th Central Committee, November 2013, right? The third plenum reform package, 64 categories, 320 odd reforms. Very commendable. But I think every analyst of China and the Chinese economy is of the view that there has been minimal implementation of that third plenum reform package 2 years later, almost 3 years later, 2.5 years later. Less than 10%, in fact, is the general consensus. So there has been no sense of sequencing or prioritization, and very little movement, frankly, on virtually every one of these, with the exception of regulatory streamlining. There is some good news. They've slashed 246, I think, state council approvals that were needed. They're trying to deregulate part of the economy, but basically all the other bullet points have simply festered and gotten worse in the last 2.5 years since the third plenum. Then we have social challenges, which again you can see for yourself. Many of them are very acute, I would argue, and pretty severe. They have to do with income inequality. That's not a new problem, but China's Gini coefficient is in the top 10, if not the top 5 in the world. It's certainly in the top 5 in terms of the growth rate of the Gini coefficient over the last 5 years. China's becoming more unequal, not less, in the last 5 years, if I understand the statistics. Wages are relatively stagnating. One really telling factor, I think, it actually says as much about the country politically as it does socially, is the middle class and the upper class are increasingly moving their assets and themselves and their family members abroad in ever-increasing numbers. The political implications of that are pretty clear. When the elite of a country have one foot out the door, it doesn't tell you that they have a whole lot of confidence in the future of their own system. Then you have what I call the volatile periphery, by which I mean Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, all 4 of which have their own challenges, each of which are driven by different factors, but taken together, this is not a peaceful periphery, shall we say. Intense repression of civil society, we're all aware of that. The NGO law last week, just more evidence of very, very concerning trends in that sphere, the so-called public sphere, over the last few years, part of which has to do with stricter control of the media, of the educational system from top to bottom. And I mean from from nursery school to higher ed. The ban on Western textbooks in Chinese universities is part of that. The urbanization transition, enormous plan, which, if they succeed by 2020, will have moved 70% of the population will live in urban areas. But just the magnitude of the planned transition, this is Li Keqiang, the premier's kind of pet project, right? And it's impressive. The plans are impressive, and it's really going to be interesting to watch how that unfolds. Demographic transition, baby boomers retiring, wages rising, the implications of that for the next topic, provision of public goods, including pensions, on which Professor Fraser here is the world's leading expert, in fact. You'll find yourself quoted in the book, actually, Mark, in several places. When it came to pensions, I read everything you've written, learned a lot from it. Environment, energy, and so on. Then we turn to politics. I said I wasn't going to go through these in any great detail, and I really don't want to take too much more time on it. But clearly the political system is changed since, I would say, since 2009. It hasn't changed just since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. Some of the trends that we have seen since 2009 have deepened and become more intensified since 2012, but I actually predate them to Xi Jinping's promotion at the last Congress. Part of that has to do with the anti-corruption campaign, a very good thing, to be sure. I'm all in favor of the anti-corruption campaign. It's very needed. It was and still is probably, a very widespread, serious cancer on the entire Communist Party, on the military, on the government, and on society itself. So Xi Jinping deserves a lot of credit for trying to tackle that problem. But the campaign has had a lot of side effects, one of which is the third bullet point. It's produced what's described by some scholars as a culture of fear, again, in the society, a frozen policy apparatus, cadres who are not physically going to work or doing their jobs. That's one reason, in fact, the economic third plenum reform program has stalled, I would argue. The anti-corruption campaign has some good aspects, but also has some collateral side effects that we need to look at. And you can read the rest of them for yourself. I mean, it's a long litany of indicators about intensified repression. China is more repressive today than it has been at any time since the aftermath of 1989. I know, I lived there in 1989, 1990, 1991. It's not as bad now as it was then, but it's as close as it's been now to what it was then, and it is trending in that direction. It can get, as I'll describe in a moment, it can get worse. And then finally, just in the fourth chapter on China's foreign relations, here I would describe them as overall mixed on a global basis, but increasingly fraught and complicated and indeed strained. In very few regions would I describe China's foreign relations as unquestionably positive, except perhaps in Central Asia and the Middle East. There are two regions where China seems to have pretty good and unadulterated ties. Everywhere else, though, relations with the European Union, with Latin America, with African countries, certainly with the United States, and I would argue even with Russia under the surface, and with India, and with every country around China's periphery, every single one, including North Korea, China's relations are very strained. Well, should this surprise us? No. This is to be expected, I would argue, entirely predictable for a rising power and a rising assertive power. China is beginning to flex its muscles, its monetary muscles, its military muscles, and it would like to flex soft power muscles, but as we'll see in a minute, I don't think China has a lot of soft power muscles, despite the investment of about $10 billion a year into this sphere. They're not getting a lot of return for their investment. Hard power, absolutely increasing. The Chinese military and the Navy in particular footprint is broadening further and further into the Western Pacific through the Indian Ocean littoral. Its ballistic missile programs and other conventional weapons programs have been steadily building for many years. This is not a crash program, but it's a very steady program that has seen some significant technological advancements that many analysts, myself included, would not have predicted 10 or 15 years ago. So the Chinese military, it's fair to say now, is the second or third most capable military in the world, depending on how you compare it with Russia. Certain areas the Russians are more proficient than the Chinese, certain areas the Chinese are more proficient than the Russians, both of them trail behind the United States, but whoever you put in number 3 is a long way behind. So China's military footprint increasingly strong. Where I will give China credit on the foreign policy front is in the area of global governance. Here, I think, since Xi Jinping has come to power, we have seen a real uptick of China's participation in several realms of global governance, from climate change to anti-piracy work to fighting pandemics and ODA, number of things. Now, you will also recall that China had been widely criticized by Robert Zoellick, for example, in his famous speech in 2005 here in New York City for not being a responsible international stakeholder, and by scholars, including myself, for not carrying its own weight, for not punching below its weight, and not contributing to global governance commensurate with the country's resources and potential. Well, I think now, in the last 3 years, China is pulling its own weight much more and is contributing, and its contributions have actually increased, however you measure them, financially or otherwise. So that's a kind of good news story. But I would argue that China, as I did in my previous book, is still a partial power that lags significantly behind the United States in global power and influence. Okay, so that's a kind of series of snapshots of the functional chapters in the book. As I say, I'm happy to come back and discuss any of those in the question and answer period. But let me spend the rest of the time kind of telling you what the core argument of the book is and elaborating that. So China's future is not unlike an automobile that is going into a roundabout. And when you go into a roundabout, of course, you have several options. You can come out of the roundabout in different places. Or I suppose you could just continue to go around and around, but that won't get you very far. So the question is twofold, really. Which road do you select to come out of, and what road do you come in on, right? All cars enter the roundabout on an established road. So that established road is, as the slide indicates, what I call hard authoritarianism. And it has 4 choices, as I see it, for coming out of the roundabout. And I'll talk about each of those 4 in sequence. But the road that China is on now is the path that it has been on since 2008, 2009. That is really a very crucial year in China's internal and external behavior. A lot of things changed that year, and just coincidentally, I happened to be living there that year. It's right after Ambassador Rao. That was the last year of your service as ambassador in Beijing. I don't know if you felt these things before the summer of 2009 when you departed, but they certainly continued through the end of 2009 into 2010. So during that year, China stepped away from the path that it had been on the previous decade, from 1998 to 2008, which was a path of what I would describe as managed and measured political opening. And it reverted to much greater controls over virtually all spheres of life, increased repression, and increased centralization. So the previous 10 years included opening of civil society, relatively greater freedom for the media, for academia, for public discourse and intellectual life, greater freedom of speech and expression, and of course, greater marketization of the economy. That's the path China had been on. So if you did a similar slide to this 7 years ago, the road coming into the roundabout was soft authoritarianism. But since the change in 2009, they've been on the hard authoritarian path. So the question is, what are the implications of that? And if they stay on that path, if they take the second left-hand turning and stay on the path, what are the implications? Or what would happen if they selected one of the other 3 pathways, neo-totalitarianism, soft authoritarianism, or semi-democracy? So if they stay on the current path, in short, I argue that there will be limited reform, that is to say economic reform. There will be relative economic stagnation, and there will be political decline of the party state. And there will be increasingly acute social problems. If you think back to that slide on the social challenges, each one of those will become worse and worse. The The limited economic reform, this is not to say that they won't implement some of the third plenum package. They are implementing some of the third plenum package, but as I say, it's about 10%. Well, they may be able to get it up to 20, but the vast majority of the third plenum package, which is a very well thought through, comprehensive package, which is it's a good roadmap. The World Bank wrote it for them, right? They didn't come up with it themselves, or not entirely by themselves. It's all embodied in the China 2030 report that the World Bank and the State Council did together, right? So I will explain in a second why I think staying on a hard authoritarian path is going to produce continued relative economic stagnation. But if they were to, let's consider some of the other possibilities, though. They could revert to neo-totalitarianism. Let me just say first on the relative stagnation, the key word there is relative, right? Why? Because a $10 trillion economy growing at whatever, 3, 4, 5, or 6% GDP per year is still a really significant economy. So that's not Japanese-style stagnation, for example. I do not envision Japan-style stagnation with negative or minimal growth coupled with deflation. China will grow. The GDP numbers will be there. The question is how high. And in fact, the higher they are, the more it indicates the failure to implement the qualitative economic reforms necessary to navigate through and out of the middle income trap. In other words, if they are fixated, continue to be fixated on GDP numbers and keeping those high for full employment reasons and keeping the state-owned enterprises afloat and other vested interests, that may indicate actually a relative failure to undertake the qualitative reforms they need to do. Similarly, if they come down, as most newly industrializing countries do, to 2 or 3% GDP growth, it will be a more positive indicator that they are tackling some of those qualitative challenges. Hard authoritarianism doesn't mean the crash of China, and I want to be very clear here. I am not, and I repeat, not predicting the collapse of China, as some people seem to think I am. That was a title chosen by the editors of the Wall Street Journal, the term crack up, which in Chinese translates as bengcui, which is the same thing as collapse, which is the same thing as the term they use for the Soviet implosion. So we have several terms in English for this, but in Chinese there's one term, bengcui. And that has very, very bad connotations in Chinese. What I foresee is not bengcui, it's not collapse. I see relative economic stagnation, increasingly acute social problems, and progressive decay and decline of the political system. Decline does not equal collapse. It is a progressive process that can take years, even decades. We're talking here, as I say, about a very long-term process. The Soviet Union began its terminal decline when? Well, most analysts would say 1964, when Brezhnev overthrew Khrushchev. And the Soviet Union went through a long 27-year period of so-called Brezhnevization, even outlived Brezhnev himself, before the whole system bengquied in 1991. So, that was almost 3 decades. So what I'm describing is a similar process of decline in China. So it is not the same thing as collapse. It may lead to collapse over time, as it did in the case of the Soviet Union, or it can just continue in this kind of relatively stagnant course that China is on. Now, that's fine. If it stays on the relatively stagnant course, China's going to have a lot more problems to wrestle with. It won't have tackled the key challenges that were on those first few slides. So what about the other 3 alternatives, quickly? Conceptually, we have to consider the possibility of what I call neo-totalitarianism. It could get worse than it is today, ladies and gentlemen, the repression, that is. It's pretty severe right now, and it's getting worse by the day. It is trending in that direction. But for three reasons, I don't think it will return to the 1989-90 period. First is the private sector of the economy is already too deeply entrenched and is, in fact, the growth engine of the entire economy. A number of statistics that I could give you that would support that conclusion, but just read Nick Lardy's latest book, Markets Over Mao. The private sector is booming in China and is driving GDP growth, consumer spending, service sector, and so on. You can't put that genie back into the bottle, I don't think. Second reason is that the citizenry, I think, would resist and perhaps revolt if the relative freedoms that they've known over the last 40 years were rolled back like they were in the wake of 1989. We're seeing some signs of this resistance in recent months. And the third reason that I don't think neo-totalitarianism is a realistic option, it's a conceptual possibility, is that elements of the party and the military would not necessarily endorse such a revisionist change of national course. And these two key institutional pillars of power, party and military, would therefore split. And if they split, then there are unpredictable consequences in China. So even though this is a conceptual possibility that could grow out of the failure of hard authoritarianism, there would be a series of hardline leaders who would come to the fore and say, we've got to really crack down even further on our society. I don't think it would work. It would, in fact, maybe produce really unintended consequences. Third alternative is soft authoritarianism. Okay, so that, as I say, had been the path China was on for the decade 98 to 08, engineered by a man named Zheng Qinghong, the right-hand man of Jiang Zemin. And you must credit Jiang Zemin, too, with supporting the soft authoritarian path. He was the leader of the country. Zheng Qinghong was, I think, by the time he stepped down, vice president of the country, third highest ranking member of the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau, and a former head of the organization department. He was a very powerful individual. He had to retire in 2008 for reasons of age. But he had been overseeing this decade-long managed incremental opening. Why? Because there were two big conclusions the Chinese drew from the collapse of the Soviet Union. They spent a lot of time, I can tell you because I studied it in my previous book, studying the collapse of the Soviet Union in Eastern European communist states, and they came to two conclusions, two competing camps, actually, in China. One camp said, well, by the time Gorbachev came along with his reforms, the Soviet system was so broken and so brittle and so fragile that it collapsed under the shock therapy. They couldn't take Gorby's reforms. And this camp in China actually said Gorby's reforms were correct. They were essentially Khrushchevite reforms, Andropov-like reforms, but the system was too broken and it shattered. It couldn't absorb it because they were not implemented incrementally, okay? So their conclusion was, you have to open the system, you have to manage that opening from above, and you do it step by step incrementally. It is feasible to do that. So that was school number one. Zheng Qinghong is the exemplar of that school. That's what they were doing, as I say, from 1995, maybe, all the way to 2008. School number two said, no. Managed opening is impossible. It will cascade out of your control, or out of our control, our being the party. And we will fall from power. You cannot manage change in civil society and media and give people freedoms because they want more. And that will, as I say, you'll lose control. So don't even go there in the first place. That was the second school. And guess what? In 2009, school number two came to the fore. Why? Three or four reasons, briefly, if you're interested. Personalities. They matter in China. Zheng Qinghong had to retire. There was no patron to continue to guide the soft authoritarian path. Number two, events, starting with Charter 08, followed by the uprisings in Tibet, followed by, in the spring of 08, followed by the uprisings in Urumqi in the spring of 09, followed by Liu Xiaobo and the Nobel Peace Prize issue in the fall of 09, the the Arab Spring, Jasmine Revolution in 08, 09. And so there were some circumstantial issues that strengthened the hand of the second faction that I just described. And there's big money, by the way. This faction wasn't just a kind of ideological faction. Their bureaucratic sources, what I call the Iron Quadrangle, the propaganda system, the internal security system, the military, and the state-owned enterprises. Those four very well-funded, politically very strong bureaucracies in China came together in a coalition and said, no more managed incremental change from above. We have to crack down. And guess what? There's big money in repression. So they got their coffers. All four of those entities got a lot of investment from the state. Okay, so you may wonder, why 09? What happened in 08, 09? Well, that's my assessment of what happened. And I lived through it. It was very interesting to kind of witness. Okay, so so they could go back if they wanted to, theoretically, to soft authoritarianism. And there is a school of thought that says Xi Jinping is just cracking down before he opens up. Next party Congress, he will have cracked down to the anti-corruption campaign, then he will be, we'll see a new Xi Jinping. He'll take off his cloak and we'll see the reformist Xi Jinping come to the fore. There is that school of thought circulating out there. I do not subscribe to that. I think what we have been seeing from Xi Jinping is the real thing, and we're going to get more of it. There's a second school of thought that argues that the next party Congress next year, we could witness a power struggle between the soft authoritarians who remain in the Politburo. Mind you, there's going to be a lot of personnel changes next year. 13 of 25 Politburo members are going to have to step down for reasons of age requirements, leaving the 12 individuals, if you examine them individually one by one, about 8 of them have had very progressive, soft authoritarian backgrounds in the provinces prior to the last party Congress. They could produce a kind of coalition, soft authoritarian coalition, that might challenge Xi Jinping. That might make for what I call a brokered convention with Chinese characteristics. We'll have to wait and see. And then the fourth pathway, potentially, semi-democracy. What I have in mind here is Singapore, in short. Singapore writ large. That's not a novel thought. The Chinese themselves have spent a lot of time studying Singapore. Actually, if I had to redraw this diagram, I would have it as a new road coming out of soft authoritarianism. I think it evolves out of soft authoritarianism. It's not a separate choice necessarily. So these are the 4 alternative pathways I see. These are the consequences of each in this slide. What are the implications for China? Now, I know we got to start a little bit late, Mark, right? But I'll try and bring this to conclusion. Well, it's always easiest for cars, people, governments to stay on the same course that they've been on. It's called path dependency in political science. It's the easiest way to muddle through, keep doing what you're doing with incremental adjustments. Why? Vested interests make it so. Unknown consequences are another deterrent. It's very hard to change a nation the size of China. But China has to change if it's going to deal qualitatively with the challenges of being a newly industrializing economy. Let's go back to the comparative perspectives now. China's at a point, this is the so-called J curve, which is a concept that Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group here in New York came up with, published a really interesting book on a few years ago. It examines the relationship between stability, social stability and political stability, and openness of a society. Now you can see the dip. Where you want to be if you're a developing or a developed country is on the upper end of the curve, right? The more open a country is, Bremer and a lot of evidence, social science evidence argues, the more stable a country becomes. However, there's this big gulf that you have to go through to get to the upper right-hand end of the curve. Bremer argues that China is very much on the left-hand side of the curve today and is going to have to go through some significant tumult. Although I think he argues, too, that opening can be managed from above. It is feasible. But Bremer or any other social scientist that you read, I would commend to you a book called Why Nations Fail by James Robinson and Darren Acemoglu. They argue that all newly industrializing societies have to become inclusive states, they argue, and that facilitate economic activity through opening of society and opening of the political system. The point here is at this stage of development for China, the relationship between politics and economics is direct. And politics is the independent variable, economics is the dependent variable. The last 30 years, folks, it's been the other way around. Now politics is going to drive the success or failure, relative failure, of China to get through the middle income trap and become an innovative society in particular. Innovation, you have to innovate your way through that trap. It's the only way out. Consumer spending and growth of service sector will help, but it's not going to do it. You're not going to move up the value-added curve, break through the so-called developmental ceiling, and become a post-extractive, innovative society without political openness. I did not use the word democracy there, but there is not a single case of a newly industrializing economy that has emerged out of the middle-income trap, and there are only 11 of 100, according to the World Bank, that have come through. 11 out of 100. That means that 89, the middle income trap, most countries get stuck. They don't get through. Of the 11 that have come through, most of them went into the trap as an authoritarian country. They all came out as some form of a democratic country. So that's the challenge for China. It's not a secret. This is not new news to social scientists. Since the 1960s, modernization theorists, Lipset, Huntington, Rostow, Organsky, Apter, and others have all identified this necessity. So this is not a secret. But I think modernization theory and the experience of other newly industrialized economies tells us a lot about what to expect from China. Then, as I say, we have to look at China as a Leninist-type political system. And there are very predictable phases that all Leninist-type political systems pass through, about 7 or 8 of these phases that you can see on this slide. The reason there's a question mark at the end is because not a single communist-type Leninist political system has ever succeeded in institutionalizing what Huntington first called adaptation. In fact, I wrote a previous book called China's Communist Party, Atrophy and Adaptation, which was published in 2008. Just before the changes I've just described. And I argued then that China was adapting under Zheng Qinghong, but they haven't been since. So there's no, positive example of a Leninist-type political system doing this on any kind of permanent basis. Indeed, Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of my academic heroes and otherwise, in his very prescient book called The Grand Failure, you might have read that or remember that. It was published 2 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Brzezinski argued that communist party states in this penultimate and moribund phase, and I quote from Brzezinski, he said, "In this phase, the communist leadership loses confidence, evinces a deep insecurity, and tries to reassert control. Rule becomes rule for rule's sake. The governing rationale is stripped bare to its core, maintaining power," unquote. Well, ladies and gentlemen, when I look at China today, those words of Brzezinski's seem quite applicable and quite relevant. So both the modernization theorists and the comparative communism theorists, I think, have a lot to offer us in trying to understand the challenges facing China today, but more importantly, the behavior of the Chinese regime today. These challenges are already beginning to bite. They're very predictable. You study a lot of other newly industrializing economies, they're all very right there. The World Bank has told China, you don't do A, B, and C, D, E, and F are going to follow. So this is not a secret. It's a pretty profound dilemma for China. Quite simply, it's not moving ahead politically, and therefore there will be increasing limits on how it develops economically and socially. I did not say collapse. I don't think it, and I don't want China to collapse. So I want to be clear on that point too. So in conclusion, let me just tie this up. I look forward to Ambassador Rao's commentary, there are two general scenarios I see. First, recognize China's challenges are unprecedentedly complex, both because of size and the qualitative nature of the challenges, but they're not insurmountable. There are two scenarios. They can go back to soft authoritarianism and political reform, which will increase the chances of qualitative economic reforms and social reforms, get out of the middle income trap, and transition towards a mature modern economy. Or they stay where they are now, which will produce economic stagnation, aggravated social problems, and political decline. It's pretty simple, in my view, maybe overly simple. But the ultimate question is, does the party have the confidence to open up politically in order to succeed economically and socially? Up until 2009, they seemed to have that confidence. They were adapting, but things shifted, and they are acting in an extremely insecure way today, I would argue, which suggests to me they don't have confidence in their future. They are doing exactly what Brzezinski argued communist parties at this stage of their development do. So with that, let me end my formal comments and look forward to Ambassador Rao's commentary and be happy to take your questions too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 谢谢. I will, yes, briefly introduce Ambassador Rao, who Professor Shambaugh referred to. We're very lucky at the India-China Institute in many ways. One of the programs we most enjoy is the Visiting Scholar program, which brings to our campus for a month or so distinguished scholars, practitioners from China or India, depending on the year. And this year, it's just been a great intellectual, professional treat to have Ambassador Nirupama Rao here at the India-China Institute. She is, as Professor Shambaugh mentioned, former ambassador of India to the United States from 2011 to 13, and then was India's ambassador to China, as he also mentioned, from 2006 to 2009. She now holds an appointment at the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University, the Brown India Initiative, where she teaches part-time. Her other ambassadorial assignments, I should note, have included postings in Peru, Bolivia, and Sri Lanka. And she has extensive experience, as her resume suggests, in looking at relations between India and China. I'm really looking forward to the project that she's working on with us while she's here, which is a look at Sino-Indian relations from 1949 until 1962. And I'm also looking forward to hearing her reactions to Professor Shambaugh's talk. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Rao.
Stay here. What's your preference?
I can stay here.
Okay.
Well, that was a fascinating talk, and I think everything you said carries a lot of meaning and relevance for all of us who contemplate the future of China. Coming from India, China is our largest neighbor, and everything that happens in China seems to cast a shadow in the region, not the least for us. Another huge Asian country next door to China, and we've had a troubled relationship with China. While we call that relationship normalized at this moment, there has been no conflict on the border we share for over 4 decades now. The fact is that there are many, many unresolved problems in the relationship. And now, as you mentioned, with China's growing assertiveness, its muscularity, its very, well-articulated nationalism, I think, we all wonder what the future is going to bring, not only for China, but for all of us in the region. This is not a situation of helplessness, although I think we watch China very carefully, and countries like India are definitely, I believe, growing in strength and influence, and that is going to certainly, affect the future equilibrium also in the region. I have watched China for over 3 decades now, and I basically agree with your conclusions, Professor Schamberg, on the political and economic trends in China today. And to my mind, everything seems to be predicated on the survival of the Communist Party of China. Everything they do and say is predicated on the need to survive, on the need to sustain themselves, on the need to endure. And therefore, that really impacts the prospects for political change in the country. There are many warning signals, as you said, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to the debt ratio to GDP, the overspending and the extravagance that we've seen. In India, we do things very differently. We're the other end of the spectrum. We edge very much towards conservatism when it comes to financial management and our budgetary affairs. But be that as it may, I think China and what happens there impacts all of us. It impacts our destiny, our future, whether it's in the United States or in India. And I think today the United States and India, with the growth in their bilateral relationship and the fact that we discuss a lot that happens in the region, I think what happens in China is going to be very much a part of that narrative, of that interface between two of the world's largest democracies. I have a question before we start the discussion with the audience from the book, and this is of special interest to me because I have studied our borders with China for a long time now, and what happens there certainly concerns me and a lot of scholars like me in India. Now, you mention at page 91 of the book about the whole question of climate change and the fact that Himalayan glaciers are melting at a rapid rate, that the prospect has profound and dangerous implications because the glaciers in the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush feed all of 7 Asia's greatest rivers: the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, the Mekong, the Salween, the Indus, the Ganges, and the Brahmaputra. And that if there's one transnational environmental issue in Asia, calling out for multinational collaboration, it is this one. I would like you to perhaps dwell a little on this aspect because that really didn't figure in what you discussed just now, but it's of profound significance for people, and people are at the heart of all this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Ambassador Rao. I should say Foreign Secretary Rao. She not only served as ambassador to 3 countries, was also India's foreign secretary as well. Good question about the water resources. We live in an era of so-called transnational security issues. This political scientists call the securitization of everything, basically. But water is recognized to be one of the crucial issues, not just in Asia, but indeed even in this country, in the western part of the United States, but in parts of North Africa. It's a global issue, and we're familiar with that. But because of the rivers running off of the Tibetan Plateau, it involves at least a half a dozen or more countries. And if you include the Indochina countries along the Mekong, maybe 10 countries. So this is an issue tailor-made for multilateral work. I'm aware of at least one non-governmental effort that has governmental support, a classic Track 2 effort that is underway, was being led by Professor Catherine Morton at the Australian National University, but included scholars from China, Nepal, India, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam, I believe. So I'm not an expert in this area, but the problem is the dams. The Chinese, it's not just a question of glacial melt, it's a question of Chinese dam building on the upper reaches of all of these rivers. The Brahmaputra, the Irrawaddy, the Salween, they all flow down from Tibet. And China's damming a number of those. So, it's like the South China Sea island building how are you going to get China to stop building islands and damming the upper reaches of these rivers? I'm not sure, save trying to talk to China, that other countries have a whole lot of options, but bringing China in is one way forward. Publicizing the issue. There isn't a lot of attention to this issue in the global media that I'm aware of. That will get the world's attention. And it's a multilateral issue. So I think there's potential diplomatically here and for track two for scholars and for each of these member states to get collectively involved in this issue. But thank you for your kind comments on the book. And by the way, there are books available for purchase. I hope we've incentivized you maybe after the talk to go and get one. We just passed Mother's Day yesterday, but Father's Day is still coming. It makes a nice gift for your father or your loved one.
Want to take questions from here?
Sure, I'm happy to take questions.
Okay. Yes, first row. Yeah. Oh, and we have a roaming mic because we're recording, so please. And let me say this before we get started. We get rolling with questions. This room is famous for some very long and some very short questions, but I want to thank everyone in advance for making your question very short and very to the point. Thanks.
Yeah.
You can get us off to a great start.
Well, one of the things about the climate change, I've been very excited about the fact that China was an authoritarian nation because I thought they can do something quicker than anyone else. And the question I have in relation to that is, you spoke about the military and how powerful it is. We use that for ARPANET and all sorts of things, and I want to know how innovative China is in general, how well their schools are, how well their universities are, and to what degree you think authoritarianism may help to end climate change.
That's an interesting way of asking the question. Essentially, I argue in the book, and I believe that authoritarianism is a great impediment to innovation in almost all areas, at least bottom-up innovation. I'll give you a brief sense of how I think about innovation and how I describe it in the book. I describe innovation as a top-down, bottom-up, and outside-in process. It comes from three directions. Top-down, all countries invest into R&D and into innovation, right? We have the National Institutes of Health in this country and National Science Foundation. And you will get innovation through investments like watering a plant in priority areas. And China is very clear about its, I think, 11 priority areas. Just read the Premier's work report every March, and it's very clear. The 11 areas China wants to be world leaders in: robotics, medical instruments, solar, and green technology is one of the 11. And several others, biotech, nanotech, and others. But green energy is one of the priorities. So that's an example where an authoritarian system can allocate funds and the plant will grow. And China is already a world leader in solar panels and wind turbines and now electric cars and hybrid cars. So this is a good news story. And so on that piece of the climate change puzzle, their system is actually good. And indeed, we saw in Paris, and we've seen in the 2 years since Copenhagen, Xi Jinping and the Chinese government taking some very bold, positive, constructive steps, which they were not doing pre-Copenhagen and at Copenhagen. But now they have. That's good news for the world. We've got an agreement. Wouldn't have had an agreement if the Chinese were not on board with that and didn't work together with the United States on that. And so we need, like everything else in China, implementation. But I think on the climate change innovation piece, authoritarianism is actually not a hindrance. But on other areas of innovation, it is very much a hindrance. China's not going to develop a truly innovative society unless its universities are world class, which it won't happen until it has freedom of speech and thought and breaks a lot of other cultural impediments to risk-taking, right? So if you're going to be an innovative society, you better take risks and not get punished for taking risks. You need to be incentivized to take risks, and if you fail, you won't be slapped on the hand. Now, in China, there are a lot of impediments, some political, some cultural, against risk-taking, bottom-up risk-taking. You don't have garages in Palo Alto, California, or Route 128 corridors in China. You don't have that bottom-up and small business loans and tinkerers, and you don't have people in universities who are willing to take risks. And you don't have the outside-in component. Innovation doesn't take place in a single country. It takes place in a global environment today. You have to be linked 24/7, 365 days a year with the world and your professional cohorts around the world. Well, we all know China blocks interactions, electronic and human interactions between its citizens and foreigners. So I would say only one of those three pieces of the puzzle, the top-down piece, is in place for innovation. And that's a perfect, probably the best example of the linkage between politics and economic change. If China's going to get through the middle income trap, it has to innovate its way through, and it ain't going to do so unless it politically liberalizes, in my view.
Okay, we have four additional questions to follow from the floor. Could I get you to say your name, please? I'm sorry to
Yes.
introduce. Yes.
So, Alessia Lefebvre from Columbia University. I would like to hear you on the disconnect and the extent of the disconnect between Xi Jinping and his elite, because you reminded us that this authoritarian period comes after a soft authoritarian period of 10 years, that a lot of returnees are actually people who are in the top elite of the party, of the academia, of intellectuals. So these people today, they seem to hide a little bit themselves. They don't seem to share Xi Jinping position. So to which extent what you describe is Xi Jinping and not the Chinese Communist Party? How isolated he is within the party?
Well, it's very difficult to measure. The Chinese Communist Party goes to extraordinary lengths to make itself opaque and not open to scrutiny or understanding. It's always been that way. It's gotten much, much, much worse under Xi Jinping. But we can, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that this man has centralized power in his own persona to a degree we have not seen since Mao. Okay, and he has therefore broken a 3-decade-long norm that was widely accepted and institutionalized for collective and consensual decision-making. Xi Jinping is making all the decisions by himself. And the system, therefore, has frozen up. The think tanks, if you talk to people working in these think tanks, as I do, they aren't being asked to write papers. They're afraid to submit papers, because if you say something that's different than what the boss wants to hear, it's the same dynamic as we had in 1958, 59, on the eve of in the early phases of the Great Leap Forward. So there is a kind of a distortion to the extent that advice is even being given. But my understanding, albeit anecdotal, is that the advice is not flowing up to the top. The consultative dimension of the political system over the last 30 years has broken down. Xi is making all the decisions himself. And then the anti-corruption campaign has so frozen the policy bureaucracies across several areas that he's not getting compliance on his directives. And he thinks that he can just order a directive and, like under Mao, it will be implemented. China doesn't work like that anymore. And he's learning the age-old rule of bureaucratic resistance. If you're a bureaucrat in any system, I dare say maybe even in the Indian system, and you don't agree with the policy that comes from the center, whoever is at the center, your best way of resistance is just inertia, is not acting. You just don't implement it. You don't do anything. You don't openly resist. You don't complain. You just sort of sit on your hands, and you don't do anything. That's what's happening in the Chinese bureaucracy with the economics reform program, I think, to a large extent, plus the culture of fear. People are so afraid they take a step this way that tomorrow the atmosphere will change, and then they will be criticized for having done what they did yesterday. So all of this has frozen up the policy system in China in a very profound way. And it's having an effect on Xi Jinping's economic reform plan, I would argue.
Hi, my name is Avneet. I work for EIR Publication, founded by Lyndon LaRouche, the economist. Mm-hmm. My question is about, on this question of innovation, the China Space Program. They recently, on April 29, celebrated National Space Day. And the Chinese Space Program, which is pinnacle, especially by their commitment to mine helium-3 on the moon, which is also a commitment by Indian scientists, and also to fund fusion research, which puts the best of minds at the forefront of your policy making. Not bureaucracy, because it doesn't function that way. It's very reminiscent of what America used to be like in 1960s and think like, especially the Apollo missions. But this Chinese space program and collaboration with other nations, India, Russia, and United States possibly, do you have any comments on that, or do you notice any shift in the Chinese population, because they are very, from as far as I know, very excited about this?
China's space program is commendable. It's probably the most active one in the world today. And it's showing the results of decades, in fact, of investment. This is not something they just came to yesterday. In fact, it dates back to the late 1950s when they began their ballistic missile program and their nuclear weapons program. And countries that have advanced space programs, it generally tends to grow out of ballistic missile and nuclear weapons programs. So China is not exceptional in that regard. But there are a variety of reasons I think they're pursuing it. One is status, right? If you're a global power, you need aircraft carriers and space programs and a few other accoutrements, gold medals at Olympics and so on. So I think there is a status motivation for China's investment in the space program, and there are bureaucratic motivations too, and funding, right? It's the plant. I would put space in the category of the top-down innovation, right? It's just like any of the other 11 priority areas. You water the plant, it'll grow. And they have been showering the space program, which after all is a military program in China. This is not a civilian program in China. So they've been getting good results. They're going to have a man on the moon, they claim, or a person on the moon by 2020. And they have a Mars program. And the Russians have been very helpful to the Chinese, too. Mind you, because of the military nature of the program, the Chinese have not had access, certainly to American expertise in technology. They've had some to the French and the Aerospace program, is my understanding. But the Russians have been pretty instrumental, but they've done most of it on their own. So I'm not saying that, I think they deserve credit for what they've accomplished, and we've just begun to see it. It's a good news story.
Okay, yeah, we're up to 6 questions, so thanks for keeping them nice and short. Oh, please.
Just
Ambassador
weighing a
Rao.
little on what you said about India and China collaborating on this issue. For a brief period in the 1980s, there was some prospect of that. Actually, when Rajiv Gandhi, the Prime Minister, went to China, we signed an agreement for cooperation in the field of peaceful uses of outer space, as it was said. But it didn't really get very far. So the two programs have essentially developed in parallel and not in conjunction with each other. And today, of course, with the closeness between India and the United States, that's an area of cooperation between our two countries that has opened up.
Yes.
Good evening. My name is Nelson Igunma. So as you were going through your talk, I immediately thinking about developing countries and their growth trajectory in general, I couldn't help but think about diasporic communities, especially in cases with the Philippines and several African countries that encourage citizens to migrate and send remittances, and even with India, where under the NDA government there's been a lot of engagement with Indians living abroad. Can you talk about any insights you gain from Chinese diasporic communities in Southeast Asia, namely the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, their political beliefs, their economic engagement with the mainland, their interest in getting involved politically, and maybe any efforts that have been made or that you anticipate the Communist Party making to either engage these communities or neutralize them as a kind of a power base, alternative power base?
Sure, it's a hugely complex subject, a diaspora in Southeast Chinese, ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, or for that matter anywhere else on the planet. In Southeast Asia, though, it has some history and some peculiarities, whereby the ethnic Chinese are some of the wealthiest components of those societies. And they have been seen by their local Southeast Asian governments as a fifth column for the so-called fifth column for the Chinese communist regime in the 1950s and 60s. There's a lot of evidence of Chinese communist support for insurgencies in Southeast Asia throughout those decades. The most noteworthy case is, of course, the failed Indonesian coup of 1965 and the bloodbath that ensued after that. So the Chinese then went through a period in the 70s of kind of non-contact, and then in the 80s and the 90s, these individuals became very useful to China again, but in a different way, financially. And so China invited remittance, not just remittances, but investment back into China in considerable numbers. And that was in the early waves of FDI into China. That's where it came from before it came from the West or from Japan. Since then, my impression is that there's not as much investment by Southeast Asian Chinese diaspora back into China as there used to be, and there's greater political distance, shall we say, between Beijing and these communities. Indeed, there's a greater, and China's also learned the lesson of its inability to kind of politically control these communities. These people don't think of themselves as citizens of the People's Republic of China, first of all, whereas the Chinese government tends to do so. And they aren't attracted to a number of elements of China in the way that the government would like to. So it's a complicated story, but there's a greater distance now, I would argue, between ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia and the so-called motherland. And it's produced some tensions. Increasing tensions.
I'm Bill Armbruster, retired journalist. Getting back to the question that this lady posed before regarding the Western-educated returnees to China, have they been leaving China now in the last 5 or 6 years because of the repression?
Yes, I'm sorry I didn't respond to that part of your question. Well, we first have to ask ourselves what percentage of Chinese students who go abroad actually do return to China. And there, the Chinese Ministry of Education provides us some very interesting statistics. Sometimes you wonder why the Chinese government offers the world some statistics and why it hides other statistics. Well, in this case, the Ministry of Education, up until 2 years ago, once they have published statistics that show that 70% of Chinese who go abroad for higher education do not return to China. 30% do, starting in 1978. In the last 5 years, up until the time they stopped giving the statistic in 2013 or 14, it had increased to 40%. So there has been, in fact, an increased percentage that in the 2000s that were going back. But bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, 60% don't go back. Your question, though, is of those who go back, but I think this is an important telling fact, first of all. First, they go out for their educations, and that's quite an indictment, I would say, of the Chinese higher educational system. Then they don't come back. Well, there are a lot of reasons they don't come back, but those that do come back, this is your question, are they now trying to get out again? And the answer is yes. They're highly frustrated people. They've been exposed to the world, they've been exposed to the New School, Columbia, other institutions of higher education. They understand how the world works and they are chafing. I know a number of these people. They're just chafing under the political atmosphere in China today. They can't do their work, they can't invent. They can't do their research. There's all these political constraints on their research, no matter if they're in physics or in social sciences. So that's part of there's a big pool of these so-called sea turtles, Haigui Pai, who are now going abroad again. We are inundated with visa requests, with foreign visiting scholar requests. And they're applying for EB-5 visas. Some of these people have money, so they're investing abroad. Their parents happen to have money. So there is this net outflow, $950 billion last year from China, in non-ODI. So this is part of the story. And I think you're just going to see increasing indications of the best and the brightest, the educated elite of China who have been educated abroad, not being content at home and trying to go abroad again. Last factor, when they come back to China, there are certain careers that are foreclosed to them. For example, a career as a diplomat. I have several students who would love to work for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Guess what? You've been educated abroad in a foreign institution. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs will not employ you because you've been either indoctrinated or you're a CIA plant who will, long-term mole who will somehow come out later. So, that's quite telling. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs won't employ students who've been studied abroad. I would imagine the Indian Foreign Service doesn't have that prohibition.
Well, there is an open examination, and if you qualify, you get in.
You get in.
Yeah.
My name is Lei Ping, and I thank you so much for this illuminating talk. And I actually wanted to mention that a lot of my students were here. We just actually read your book, Chapters, and they had a lot of questions for you, but unfortunately, I'm going to speak for them. I'm a faculty member. I didn't introduce myself here at the New School, and also a research scholar at the Indian China Institute. So I had a question about political adaptation that you mentioned, which is sort of the key link between the political and the economy, sort of in the Chinese economy. And judging upon the arguments that you made in the beginning of the book, I wanted to ask about the Huntington model, and is there such a direct relation between sort of past dependency in terms of politically loosening and liberalizing kind of process that would eventually help China's economy to kind of go back to its own track? And what would you predict on the future sort of afterlife or life of socialism in this case?
Well, nice to meet you. I saw your photograph and biography on the website of the India-China Institute, and I'm delighted to make your acquaintance, but I am not sure I fully understand your question. It's about path dependency, so as I think I tried to explain, if path dependency is the easiest choice for any government. In fact, what happened in 2008-9 is an exception. China really went off the path, the soft authoritarian path, and did actually pivot. And there are reasons I explained for why that happened. And they could pivot again. Any of us who study Chinese politics know about something called the Fang Shou Zhou Qi, the cycle of opening and closing. Fang, to open, Shou, to close. Since 1978 and Deng Xiaoping's ascension to power, China has been through, I think, 7 cycles of opening followed by closing. The opening periods last usually 6 to 7 years, and they're followed by 2 to 3 years of closing, and then opening starts again. As I say, there have been about 6 or 7 of these cycles going back to 78. I've lived through both of them. We are now in year 6 or 7 of show, of closing. This is an extended period of closing, and China's overdue, one might say, for a return to the opening. But the point is there's been this oscillating pattern basically between hard authoritarianism and soft authoritarianism going back to 1978, right? We had soft authoritarianism all the way up to 89 under Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang. Boom. Then it went to neo-totalitarianism from 89 to 92, and then it reverted briefly to hard authoritarianism until Li Peng was sent into retirement. And somewhere around 97 or 8, I would argue, they returned to soft authoritarianism for 10 years, and they went back to hard authoritarianism. The path they've never taken is the semi-democratic path. Zhao Ziyang was on that way in the late 80s. That would have evolved out of soft authoritarianism if Zhao Ziyang had endured and had his way, but it didn't happen. So, if that, I'm not sure that was the question you're asking, but there is this kind of cycle, oscillation pattern that we've seen really for 35 years. But I don't know. As much as wishful thinking would like me to say that soft authoritarianism will return, I see no indications in the regime or in Xi Jinping himself that there's an inclination to go there because of what I argued. They believe they cannot control, they cannot manage opening, that it will cascade out of their control and then they'll lose power. And it's all about power. It's not about reform. It's not about opening. It's not about innovation. It's not about all these substantive issues. It's about maintaining the Communist Party in power. And it's a pretty zero, that's why I quoted Brzezinski. It's a pretty zero-sum approach. The way the hard authoritarians define it, zero-sum. The soft authoritarians define it in positive sum. You can manage change, and you will stay in power. You will prolong your longevity. That goes back to Huntington, right? But you have to adapt. You have to go through the J curve and adapt and open. It's a gamble. And, you know, some authoritarian regimes are willing to take the gamble. This current regime doesn't seem willing to take that gamble. So fine, they don't take the gamble. What does that mean? It means stagnation. Stagnation of a $10 trillion economy. It doesn't mean China's going to collapse. It's going to have solar panel and wind turbine innovation. It's going to have other innovation in the Shenzhen area. It's going to have a lot of things, but it's going to get stuck forever in the middle income trap.
Okay, down here on the left.
Hi, professors. First and foremost, thank you very much for the speech. It's very informative, even to Chinese people, myself. My name is Alan Chen. I'm from China. Spent the past 5 years in London, in the United Kingdom. Currently working for the world's largest investment companies on Wall Street.
To the mic, please.
So I think based on my own experience, both in the EU and on Wall Street, I can see more business or collaborations, interactions between the Western companies and the Chinese. However, speaking for the younger generations, I was born after 1990s. I can't really see that many Chinese folks in the audience. So that says something, especially we have so many Chinese students in the city. And I guess that brings up a question in terms of the implementations of the changes the Chinese government want to make. Okay, so speaking of economics, Chinese debt problem is so obvious. We have the debt to GDP ratio is around 284%. And then the younger generations, they lack the enthusiasms to change the world, right? And at the same time, we have these debt problems. So at some point, the economic conditions will affect their daily lives. However, the younger generations, they are not willing to act on it. So my question will be, to what extent you think the government will be forced to implement new policies that might not be adopted by the younger generations, or they will implement more stimulus or incentives to allow more younger generations to go abroad. However, like you said, most of them, maybe like myself, we don't want to return to China. So there's a dilemmas over there. So is there a way out of that?
Well, I thank you for your question. I think in some ways you've answered your own question, though. You voted with your feet. You're working on Wall Street. You're not working in Beijing. So, you know, that just proves the thesis in many ways. I'm not blaming you for that. If I was a young Chinese and had a chance to work on Wall Street, I'd work on Wall Street instead of Zhongguan Sun any day. I'm not being facetious. You know, there are real reasons not to want to work in China, and those who have returned, the 40%, are highly frustrated. They have all these advanced skills that they acquired abroad through very hard work and study, and they're not able to use them domestically. And so the relative, relative opportunities are much better abroad. China, by the way, is not unique in this regard. If you look at South Korea, Taiwan, Iran, other developing countries, in Malaysia for a while, that's this stage of development when authoritarian political systems were so repressive domestically and wages hadn't risen to a comfortable level. The educated classes left the country, right? And then when wages reach a level combined with political openness, I'm not going to use the word democracy, but you can have liberalization and political openness, then the attractiveness to return home increases, and you will see this with China. So your question is, what's going to incentivize the regime to change course, to incentivize people like yourself to go back? I mean, I'd like to answer your own question. I suspect many Chinese are never going to go back, to be honest with you, because they've seen the last 60 years of oscillation, capriciousness, the government changing from one day to the next, 1 month to the next, 1 year to the next. They cannot trust the future. You know, I think there's a high degree of apprehension in China about the future, and hence a kind of Hobbesian society. Take what you can get today because you may not have it tomorrow. Somebody's going to take it away from you tomorrow. The government may take it away, or there'll be some campaign, some Yundong that comes along, or you'll be an anti-corruption campaign, or your foreign assets will be frozen, or something might happen. There's just there's a lot of distrust in Chinese society, and that's a kind of cancer of its own. And amnesia, I would argue, too, but that's another story. Here we have, in a week or so, the 50th anniversary of the Cultural Revolution, one of the more significant events in 20th century history, and certainly in China's history. What is the Chinese government going to say about it? We'll wait and see. On May 25th, the anniversary of Nei Yuanzi's Dazibao at Beida, I suspect it'll just go right by, and Chinese government won't say a word about it. Why? Well, it doesn't want to open that Pandora's box, but there are many other Pandora boxes. This is a state, and unfortunately a society, suffering from collective amnesia, enforced amnesia. And you can't build a future for any society, I would argue, if you don't have honesty about the past. Right?
We're speaking of future. Our future is limited, and we have 5 questions from people who've been waiting very patiently. Would you want to take 2 or 3
Sure.
in batches? Okay, so we'll start here, and then I'll direct it back to you who've been waiting next. Yes.
Gabriel Avgerinos, Energy Mentors International. In view of the comments that you made about hard authoritarianism, and in view of what we've just heard over the last month from China here in the U.S., which might be filtered, the question is, we've heard about the coal program that was permitted in a very big way in 2015, as much as 170 gigawatts of new coal power plant generation. And almost within a week, it was very quickly in the New York Times talked back by the authorities. No, this is just the plants that were already licensed or are under construction, but we're not going to continue, et cetera, et cetera. Keeping in mind that that is really the hard authorities speaking, because it's a lot of government owned, versus at the same time almost, announcements about solar and clean renewables. Mm-hmm. What are we to believe? Are they both going on, or is one a little bit of lip service on a small basis and the other one is the big Megillah that's continuing?
Well, I'm not a specialist in Chinese energy issues, or for that matter, environmental issues. But I think the way you ended your question is probably the answer to your question. It's both. It's not either or. And I think you inferred that the big part of that is the coal part, the small part is the renewables part. China has the world's largest coal reserves. That's not going to change. And they're doing all kinds of things with nuclear as well, building 18 or 20 power plants at the moment. So, we'd love China to wean itself from the from its coal burning. I remember as a student living in China in the early 1970s and 80s, you couldn't breathe because of coal. Different reasons in some ways today. But other than that, I think it's a challenge. And beyond that, I'm not sure what to say.
Okay, again, let's try to
thank you.
Quick questions, and then you can answer 2 or 3.
Okay, I'll take these 3 together. Maybe.
Take them together.
Well, with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and America asserting its power in the South China Sea, could we stumble into a hot war?
Okay, and then back here to Matt.
Thank you, Dr. Shamba, for the great talk. My name is Matt Longman. I'm an undergrad at the New School at Eugene Lang. I'm not sure exactly how to formulate this question. I'll try to keep it as concise and clear as I can. Just in terms of a competing notion to the notion of power for power's sake, it seems to me that there's a history, or maybe put better, a commitment that the history of the Chinese Revolution through the Maoist period and through the period of reform has has been oriented around a commitment for Chinese ascendancy, a new period of Chinese ascendancy in relation to its longer history, and that the motivation for the hard authoritarian factions within the CCP, exemplified by Xi Jinping, could be oriented or could be in the in light of the the leaps and bounds that China's economic development has made over the last 20 years since the period of reform, or 30 years since the period of reform, that they are sort of bound to that responsibility towards Chinese ascendancy, and that the authoritarianism might come out of a place rather than power for power's sake, but actually a place that sees authoritarianism as the necessary orientation, political orientation, to achieve like a Chinese nationalist ascension in the face of what otherwise would be a pluralistic, open global economy subject to capital and all of that. So, thank you.
Okay, and can we get to Li Bo and then a couple of others if we have time after the response, you two.
Thank you. My name is Li Bo. I'm the fellow of Indian China Institute. Given your analysis of different camps during Jiang Zemin's time, particularly you mentioned Zheng Qinghong, could I assume if history could be rewinded and the current regime was not headed by someone like Xi, it would be something like Jiang Zemin, would you be willing to say that China would head for semi-democracy pathway easily? Because you certainly seem to suggest that Zheng Qinghong is more open to change and incremental changes. And also I would like to ask you your ultimate question, the assumption that whether China will head that way depends on how open, the openness of the CCP regime. Could I sort of turn that around a little bit and ask you, given your lots of knowledge on China, can you imagine, like, what are the triggers that would force that openness CCP needs?
Okay, let's get answers, and if there's time, we'll have the last two questions.
Okay. So on your first one about the South China Sea, could the United States stumble into a hot war with China in the South China Sea? Yes, absolutely. We could, and we should not be afraid of it, in my view. There are a number of claimants to those islands. The United States is not a claimant, but one of those countries that are claimants is an ally of the United States, the Philippines. And in the East China Sea, Japan is the administrator of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, and the United States has made very clear that since Japan administrates those islands, the alliance with Japan applies to them. So, the United States has made very clear, President Obama himself and Ash Carter and John Kerry and many other American officials, that indeed if there is a military clash over these islands, that the United States stands with its allies. So that's the first question, or first answer to your question, I should say. It'll be very interesting to see how the International Tribunal in The Hague rules in the next few weeks. But if it rules as everybody expects it to rule, that's only going to increase the tensions in the area. Mind you, everybody's increasing tensions. The Chinese are increasing the tensions through their island building and the militarization of those islands. We'll have fighter wings on those islands. We had China's second largest destroyer just 3 days ago go into one of those islands. We're going to have Chinese submarines going into those harbors before long, and I would not at all be surprised if we woke up one morning, opened the newspaper, and China had proclaimed an air defense identification zone over the South China Sea. All real possibilities, all escalatory, aggravating possibilities by China. Now, the United States also, one must say, is contributing to the escalation of tensions through our freedom of navigation operations. I'm fully in favor of freedom of navigation operations. We should be doing them. We should be challenging China's claimed sovereignty over these rocks that are becoming islands. That's the issue. It's all the South China Sea is an incredibly complex story, but you ask, can we stumble into a hot war with China? Yeah, we can. And we should be aware of it and should be conscious of it, and we should not shy away from it because of the possibility, you know? I didn't. Why do you think they would escalate to a thermonuclear conflict?
We are building nuclear bases around the United States is escalating nuclear conflict in the South China Sea.
How?
Well, if you look at the bases being built and
What bases?
missiles being in the Philippines, in northern Australia.
There are no American nuclear weapons bases in Australia or the Philippines. No, they're not. Not at all. So, you know, there is this
We need to move on to the next. So the other.
I think it's just preposterous to suggest we should restore World III or pilots.
I'm not suggesting we should. World War III will be a consequence of a clash over an island. You know, your leap from that to thermonuclear Armageddon, I'd like to know how you get from there to there.
The
But we
United
can
States
talk
and
about
China are
that.
thermonuclear nations.
Maybe we should discuss that.
There's no reason for you to assume that, because a territorial dispute is a territorial dispute, and you may have an escalation of tension. You may have an occasional, perhaps even a skirmish, but that need not escalate into a thermonuclear conflict. You're talking of responsible countries. Every country. No, but that's a different age, a different era. We're not in, I don't think that set of circumstances operates today. And look at us in the region, look at countries like India, we would by no means want an escalation of conflict to that level. We would like tensions to be diffused.
So, moving on to the second question, your question in the back about China's ascendancy narrative and whether authoritarianism is a successful pathway to achieving that China dream, you might say, if I could rephrase your question. First, I'd point out the ascendancy narrative goes back to the 1870s and the self-strengthening movement of the Qing dynasty. This is it's not a new narrative. Every Chinese leadership since the late Qing and Li Hongjiang has articulated that narrative. The latest iteration of Xi Jinping's China Dream. The word rejuvenation they use, Fuxing, repeatedly. That's not Xi Jinping's term, that's Jiang Zemin's term. So the narrative hasn't changed at all. Your question, though, is about whether the Chinese authoritarian regime will be successful in achieving that rejuvenation as a global power. My argument tonight and in the book is no. Very clearly, it will not. It will stagnate and have all kinds of problems. They will have much better chances if they open their political system of achieving that ascendancy. Third question about Jiang Zemin. I mean, and what would be the trigger for a return to soft authoritarianism? It's ironic that we look back now on the Jiang Zemin period and the first half or 2/3 really of the Hu Jintao era as a reformist, politically reformist period. It was, though. You know, remember the three represents, which is a very progressive concept for a communist party. Inter-party reform, competitive elections within the party, not just on the government side. They were experimenting with those in the party. Opening media, greater tolerance for intellectual freedom. There were a lot of things going on during Jiang Zemin, early Hu Jintao, that one looks back on and admires. What would it require to return to that? A change at the top. You know, unfortunately, China is still a leader-driven society. And unless there is a change at the party Congress or Xi Jinping is overthrown somehow or has a change of heart and an epiphany and wakes up tomorrow saying, oh gosh, you know, the last 4 years is not a pathway forward, we got to change. After, you know, hopefully he'll get a chance to read my book. Then change is only going to, in these types of systems, if you look at them, change comes from above. It doesn't come from below. It comes from, the openings are created from above, and then the society comes forth. That's what happened in Taiwan, that's what happened in South Korea, that's what happens in Southeast Asia, that's what happens in Latin America and other authoritarian regimes. But if the regime doesn't open or give the society the chance to move forward, and for citizens who are resident abroad to return home and contribute to that nation building, then it's not going to happen.
Because we started late, Chairman Mark says we have just 5 more minutes. So in the back, could you please ask a question? And then here, he's been waiting very patiently, very short, and then we'll wrap.
My name is Bint. I'm a faculty at the Brew College, Citizens in New York. I remember the first book I wrote, it was written about beautiful imperialism, China perceive America. My question back to this book again. Now, after 30 years, how do you think China perceive Americans? Still as a beautiful imperialist or something else?
I'm so pleased to hear that. Let me take the last question, and then I'll try and respond together.
Gabor Grbac, data analyst at VanEck, and the short question is, so you quoted 13 out of 25 turnover at the Politburo, was that correct?
Yeah, 13 will.
And what do you expect from that turnover?
Okay, well, on the beautiful imperialist question, which was actually my second book, but it was my doctoral dissertation, and it was a study of China's America watchers and their views of the U.S., and I found that they had very ambivalent views of the United States, and Malcolm will remember that. Martin will remember that. We were studying together at Peking University at the time I was researching that. So beautiful imperialists tried to capture the ambivalence the Chinese feel about the U.S. And it's a literal translation of Meiguo, or Meidi, right? So Meidi. So Chinese have always been ambivalent about the United States, and they continue to be. And that would continue today. They all want to come here to study. They all want to, open up bank accounts here, buy property here, send their relatives here, but they are the first to condemn the United States for its foreign policy behavior, its inner city conditions, its crime, it's all the various problems we have in the U.S., of which we have many. So there is this, but what has shifted is the degree of admiration. Back in the 1980s, when China was first opening, there was an extraordinary admiration for the United States that I think has really kind of ended. And it ended in the 90s. It ended after Tiananmen, it ended after the Belgrade bombing. There are a lot of things that took place between the U.S. and China. The rose wore off of the Chinese image of the U.S., and it was no longer the, shining city on the hill that it once was. In other words, the United States is no longer a kind of source of inspiration, certainly political inspiration, to China. It's a practical place for people to go, right? Get their education, get their bank accounts, get their family members out of the country. So there's still an ambivalence, but I don't think the United States is admired today nearly as much in China as it was in the 1980s. Similarly, in the United States, the bloom has also gone off the rose. Americans don't admire and respect China as we have previously either. There are a lot of reasons for this. It's not good news, but it's reality. And then last question is about the Politburo turnover in the next Congress. Well, as I indicated, 13 of the 25 Politburo members will have to retire. That leaves 12 of them in place. Not all 12, but 7 or 8 of them have very progressive records. That is at least a constituency to return to the soft authoritarian model. All of those people, Wang Yang comes to mind. Hu Chunhua, the current vice president of the country. Anyway, there are 7 or 8, as I say, that who would be advocates of returning to soft authoritarianism. But then you have the replacement of the 13. Who are those going to be? And that's an open question. We don't know. Are they going to be Xi Jinping acolytes? And then there are some Xi Jinping acolytes, but not many, 2 or 3. I can name their names: Li Jianshu, Ding Xuexiang, maybe one other individual who you can call a Xi Jinping man. So the odd thing about Xi Jinping, he's a very, very, very strong leader, but he has no clients. This is a man who has risen to the top, but without a factional network underneath him. This is very risky in Chinese politics. So he doesn't, and his anti-corruption campaign has alienated so many elites in the party, in the government, in the corporate world, and in the military, where 4,000 officers and 82 generals have been brought down in the anti-corruption campaign. He has smashed a lot of rice bowls, and he doesn't have a client base that is ready to just step up and move into place. So this is a very odd dynamic. And, sorry? Well, in some ways it is, yeah. And there may, it's very hard to speculate about. Maybe his hand will be forced by this reformist soft authoritarian group and the failure of his authoritarian path. At some point in time, people are going to say, excuse me, President Xi, we have GDP, debt ratios of 282%. Our growth rate is falling. We have overcapacity, and we're not implementing the third plenum reforms, and your one belt, one road policy doesn't seem to be going too far. He's got to deliver, and thus far, he's not doing a whole lot of delivering. So this is what we call performance-based legitimacy. This system is based on performance-based legitimacy and nationalism. So I don't know. So that could change the dynamic 2 years hence. We'll just have to wait and see. That's what makes China, maybe end on this note, China watching so interesting, is it's so unpredictable.
On that note, let's thank our speaker, Professor Shambaugh, and our commentator, Ambassador Rao.